focus on, my practice is a corporate commercial practice, meaning I don't go to court, I don't fight with people, and I focus on how to help entrepreneurs grow or scale their business, which can mean a lot of different things. It can mean taking on partners, it can mean moving to new jurisdictions, it can mean opening new locations. It sort of depends on what your business is, but that's really what I focus on, is sort of growing, scaling businesses. It can mean setting up businesses, lots of different things. And as Cecile said, if it's not something that's in my area, like if it was an employment question or it was something that's just a little bit outside of what I do, we have 100 other lawyers that I can call on in this city to help. And then we have locations in, I think, 57 countries at this point. So if we can't help you here, we almost certainly can help you in whatever jurisdiction you need to go to. So that's just a little bit about dentists. Today we're going to talk about some franchising considerations. And what I thought I would do is just give you a really brief overview of what is franchising, because I think a lot of people think they know what it is and they don't, or they have some misunderstandings about it. And I'm going to focus on sort of both sides of the equation. So when you have a franchise, and this next slide sort of gives you some of the common franchises. I'm sure that all of these little logos are things that you've seen. McDonald's probably being the #1 franchise. When you have any kind of a franchise business, there are two players. There's the franchisor, who owns the franchise, who originally started it out, and then there's the franchisee, who's the little guy who goes and maybe has one McDonald's location or two or whatever, and they go out and they run the store in whatever location they've sort of purchased the rights to do. So when I talk about the franchisor, it's kind of like the lessor in the lease situation. The franchisor is kind of the big guy, the one with all the leverage, and the franchisee is the little guy who doesn't have as much leverage. But the reason why people often consider buying into a franchise, so when you want to be a business owner, lots of people think that it's an attractive idea to go and buy a franchise and become a Dairy Queen or a Tim Hortons or whatever. And the reason for that really is because they're betting on, or they're, I guess, gambling on the acquisition of a system. So if you go and you say, okay, McDonald's, please give me a franchise, I'm going to pay you my $1 million or whatever the price is to get my franchise, you are saying, I'm getting the system, I'm getting the recipe for how many people, how many staff do I need, what does my location need to look like, who are my suppliers, where do I buy my vegetable oil to cook my French fries. All of that is set for you. So lots of people think it's really idiot-proof. So I want to be a business owner, and they're going to tell me how to run a business, and I'm going to be successful, and that's why I'm going to do that. So people do think that franchising is a good idea, and it can be a good idea. There's some things about it that are a little less known. So we'll talk about some of those as well. I just pulled from the most current list, which is 2018, which won't surprise anybody. Sort of the top 12 franchises. This is based on U.S. data primarily. You'll see that there's one UK intercontinental hotels. And as you can see, there's franchises that are possible in all kinds of industry. Fast food. Notice about pizza is different from fast food. Apparently it's its own different category on the classification. And then bakery donut also apparently is not fast food, but anyway, so there's some fancy ways to categorize these things. But the point being that there's and as you saw on the previous slide with Chuck E. Cheese, Toys R Us, there's franchises that are available in all kinds of industries. Remax is on this list, yeah, #7. In real estate, hotels, there's a couple of hotels. Subway also not fast food, apparently. Not really sure what fast food is. Sandwich or donuts or whatever, but there's a bunch of things. None of these are all common names. They're common brands that we're associated with. So it is possible to franchise. Like it doesn't have to be within a specific industry. You can get a franchise model working in sort of any industry that you want, as demonstrated by this. McDonald's, KFC, and Burger King, top 3, I think worldwide in terms of franchise brands, and therefore the most sought after or the most popular ones that people want to sort of take on, to run their own business. So when you ask the question about, and sorry, let me just stop here. I am more than happy to have you ask me questions at any point throughout. So if you have a question, don't think that you need to sit on it and wait until the end. Just put your hand up and I'm happy to answer the question at the point that your question arises. So when we think about what is a franchise, I alluded to this at the beginning. It's really the method. It's really a recipe. It's really like a package. Here is how you go and you run your business. And when you are the little franchisee out there in franchisee land, so you're out in Edmonton and you're like, I want to have a McDonald's location, you have the expectation that you are going to be taught exactly how to run a successful McDonald's business. So you're given what they often call a rule book, or sometimes they call it an operating manual. They have different names for sort of the same thing. You often sign up to their software, so lots of, especially in retail or in fast food / donut / pizza, whatever they want to call them, they often have point of sale software and they require you to use it. So if you sign up to the franchise model or the franchise system for McDonald's in my example, you don't get to make it up. You don't get to say like, hey, I'm like the superstar and I have this crazy great good software that's gonna change the world. No, you don't get to be individual or unique at all. The whole point is that theoretically, if you go to McDonald's in Airdrie, you go to McDonald's in Adelaide, you go to McDonald's in Houston, you get the same thing. You know what your quarter pounder with cheese looks like. You know what your fries are going to taste like. You know what the portions are, and the pricing is minus the currency, roughly the same.
Sorry, question. Do you mind if we take pictures?
Not at all. So really, when you buy a franchise, you're signing up to a known thing, a proven result, some sort of track record in terms of the profitability, in terms of the suppliers, in terms of all of those relationships. You sign up for all of that. And so a lot of, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of people just think, oh, this is easy because it's been done before, so I just insert myself and I kind of run it on my own. If you think about it on the other side of the equation from wearing the hat of the franchisor, so the very first McDonald's business that was ever built, in order for it to be successful, or in order for it to turn into a successful franchise, it really has to be replicable. So you really have to have a little McDonald's burger and shake shop that you can like take a cookie cutter mold of, transplant it to another location, and have it work even though the secret sauce of the first guy who set it up isn't following you to all of those other locations. So a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, I have this great idea and I'm gonna franchise it. And I'm like, oh, okay, good idea. What do you do? And how is it gonna work if you're not there? They're like, oh no, like I'm the special guy, like it all works because of me. Probably not a great candidate for franchising because you probably are cutting yourself into like 700 and putting 1/700th of yourself in each of the locations that you move to. So if you have a system, it truly has to be a system that can be replicated minus you. So if you are the guy and your business is very successful because you're there, but your business would not be successful if you weren't there, probably not a great candidate for franchising, or some more refinement, some more stuff is needed in order to turn it into something that can really be replicated that way. So when you think back to wearing the hat of the franchisee, you're signing up because you want the brand equity, so the logo, the brand, the methodology, the supplier relationships, all of the stuff that makes the business successful, you want a piece of that. And that would theoretically justify the reason why you're willing to pay the usually exorbitant franchise fees that you have to pay in order to sort of buy into that system. And sorry, one other thing, I feel like I just sort of have some random thoughts that I can share with you that are unrelated to the talk. If anybody wants a copy of the presentation, my email address is at the end. Just send me an email and I'm more than happy to email that to you. So don't feel that you need to jot down every word. I'm happy to send you an email. Or Cecilia, you can pass out my email address if someone doesn't have. I also have cards, so I'm happy to share this with you. So any questions on sort of what is a franchise, what we're talking about when we talk about franchises generally? Yeah.
Does the franchise layout say like a building plan that you have to have?
Yeah, good question. So in some cases, yes. So like with a Remax, maybe not, because some franchises you can just kind of do from your home. But if you have like a McDonald's where people have to come to your McDonald's location, yes, there would be either a building, so there would sometimes be a building layout, but they would sometimes then say, here's the building you have to go and buy, and here's how you have to build it. So it's not just like, go and find some places that have chairs and tables, but they will tell you the type of chairs and tables, and they'll tell you how many you have to have, and where your tables are compared to where your kitchen is. There has to be some sort of degree of flexibility from a compliance perspective, because you have to comply with, in Alberta, you have to comply with the Alberta building codes for, fire regulation and fire suppression on, cooking surfaces and stuff. Whereas in, I don't know, in Ontario or in Australia, those regulations will probably be slightly different. From a lighting perspective, for example, I know that that's one we looked at recently, and the lighting requirements, you had to have like a certain amount of brightness, but if you were in the US, the amount of brightness had to be double that, and it wasn't because the franchise required that, it was because the building code different, were slightly different. So yes, they will tell you that, but they will have to sort of be flexible or allow you to comply with what you have to in your specific jurisdiction. So what it often would say in your franchise agreement, it would say like, here's a diagram, or here's a sketch of what we want your floor plan to be. When you go and you find your location, submit what your actual floor plan is. Like, here's the model, here's the ideal. Go submit what yours actually is and get us to approve it before you, spend the bazillions of dollars to buy the building or renovate it or whatever. So they'll give you the model with some flexibility. They won't have flexibility on things like, red and yellow for McDonald's colors or whatever, right? But in terms of like some specifics around the layout, they'll probably be a little bit more flexible about some of those things. Any other questions? No?
When you do, like, is it normal, or is it like common practice to buy a building to be a franchise, or leasing? What's the...
So it depends on the franchise location. So Mr. Lube, for example, Mr. Lube will require that Mr. Lube, the franchisor, own the building and lease it to you. So they'll say, go find us a building and convince us that it's a good idea for us to buy it, like, within this price range or whatever, and then we'll buy it and we'll lease it to you. So it depends on the location. And the reason why they do that is, number one, they want to make more money, so they can charge you more money to lease it. And number two, if the franchise goes out of business, they then sort of like take it back into their fold and then just find another franchisee, because they're vested in, having spent the dollars to brand it and to, do the colors and do all that stuff. And they want to exert that level of sort of quality control and that level of no room for you to like make it pretty, just make it look exactly as we say. So it depends on the franchise. I can't remember in the McDonald's situation, Timmy's doesn't really care. You can go and find a building and you can either buy it or lease it, as long as it complies with, like, as long as they approve it basically at the end of the day. And like Timmy's is a good example, because like McDonald's obviously can be different sizes, but everybody knows what McDonald's looks like. Whereas a Tim Hortons can be like just a drive-through, like attached to a service station, or it can be like a standalone, building, or it can be like a little kiosk in a food court. So there's a little bit more. I guess McDonald's can have kiosks too, but there's tends to be a little. Tim Hortons is quite flexible in terms of what they do compared to many other franchises. So, some of them too, like a Toys R Us or like a Mr. Lube or a Jiffy Lube, like you don't just put those up, right? Like you have to have access for vehicles, and like there's some things that are just practical per
stipulations.
Yeah, some things that are just practical depending on the type of franchise. Okay, so who are the players? We've talked about this a little bit. There's the franchisor, and then there's the franchisee. If you have a business that you think, like somebody who started up McDonald's, or somebody who started up Dairy Queen, they would have way back 100 years ago started with just one location, and then they would have decided, oh, a way to grow or scale our business would be to replicate this and move it to other locations. So at the end of the day, or at the start of the day, I guess, all franchises start the same way with one, and then they grow sort of from there. So most people, when they start out businesses, You don't say, hey, I'm starting out to build a franchise. You kind of have to test it out. You kind of have to, get the relationships, make sure that it makes some sense, and then decide to franchise. If you start out as a franchisee, of course you can just say, well, I want to buy into this brand because I think it's good, I think it'll be profitable, and all of that. But the franchisor still starts as like the little entrepreneur, the little business owner, starting out one business, and then growing it from there. So as the franchisor, if you are in the position of being the franchisor, you own the whole system. So you would own the brand, you would own the trademarks, you would own the methodology, you would own the secret sauce for the KFC or the secret recipe for the KFC. You would own all of that intellectual property. And what you're doing when you engage with a franchisee is, number one, you're growing your brand, you're making it more prominent, you're like expanding it beyond your single location. And you're really teaching these franchisees how to be successful at the business that you have, that you're interested in. And then so because you want to maintain that consistency, you want to maintain that exclusivity, you don't want to dilute your brand, you as the franchisor are the one who's going to review the requests from like hundreds of little minions out there in the world saying, I want to franchise. They're going to have some process, and that can vary a little bit by industry, some process to screen these people to determine whether they're trainable, whether they're coachable, whether they have the financial backing to make this successful, all of those things. So they'll have some sort of a vetting process to decide whether they're willing to grant the right to franchise to these franchisees. And then in most cases, this isn't 100% truth, but in most cases, they will then be very vested in making you be successful. So like Tim Hortons has a 6 weeks like Tim Hortons University that you have to attend in Ontario, and I think you have to have like the owner and I think 2 employees, so that enough people are learning the systems. I didn't think it was all that hard to like make donuts, but apparently it is. So you have to have 6 weeks of Tim Hortons University before, like you can sign your franchise agreement, but before you can open, you have to have these people who have gone through, all of the training. They've learned the software, they've learned the relationships with the suppliers, they've learned about inventory control, all of those things. And you pay for that, right? As if you are buying into your franchise, you're paying for that training. And many of the franchises take that responsibility or that training and oversight responsibility very seriously. Some of them don't, and some of them are better in bigger centers than others, and some of them are absolutely equal. Like if you have a Tim Hortons in Vegreville or like the middle of nowhere, you still go for 6 weeks to Tim Hortons University. So some of them are better than others. So if you're considering buying a franchise, not only do you have to pass the test from the franchisor and be vetted and pass all of that, but you also have to think that it's a good idea, and you have to be committed to the training programs and committed to following the system. If you're the franchisee, you're basically the recipient of the right to use that. So a franchisee is basically a licensee who has the license to run the system in a very, very defined area, very defined jurisdiction. So you'll notice, like you don't have a McDonald's on every single street corner, whereas you do, in many cases, you have a Starbucks right across the street from each other. Starbucks is not a franchise model. But in a franchise model, the franchisor is typically very protected, very concerned that you're not having too much competition. Like it would be dumb to have McDonald's on all 4 corners of an intersection, because all 4 of those McDonald's are going to do 1/4 of the business that one of them could. And so in your franchise agreement, it will often say that we promise that we won't allow another McDonald's to come up within a radius of 10 kilometers or whatever it is. And then they have to obviously maintain that. They have to honor that obligation, because part of the success of the franchise is going to be that there isn't a ton of competition for the same brand in the same location where you're buying. So you got to work that out, and you have to understand as the franchisee in your franchise agreement, you have to understand what your jurisdiction is, and then who kind of your nearest competitors are, and that goes to sort of the question around the do you buy a building or lease a building or whatever. Franchise locations, depending on type of franchise, obviously, are very particular about things like how will traffic flow, and is there adequate parking, and because all those things can be deterrents for customers actually coming to your location. And so if there's a building, there is no ability to buy a building, but you could lease one. Sometimes they make some exceptions as long as they meet the requirements. Like, they don't love it when it's on like a one-way road and you can only access it, like, you know, just if it's very inconvenient, people will tend not to go to it. So they're very strict about that because there's those geographical boundaries or those geographical restrictions. They want to make sure that they don't put a franchise in a crappy location that no one can actually get to, and then no one is allowed to have something, you know, within some radius around there. So sometimes that factors into the decisions around buying or leasing buildings depending on the community. Franchise, if you are a franchisee, you're not limited to buying just one. So sometimes people will say, I want to buy these, you know, 6 Tim Horton locations, you know, throughout the province, or I want to buy 2 Mr. Lube locations or whatever. So sometimes, obviously the amount of money you need to do that is 2 or 6 times more. But sometimes a franchisor will be more likely to grant a franchise to, you know, to multiple locations or multiple franchises than to just a one-off. And so you do see lots of that. You see lots of kind of monopolies by particular franchisees. And then if there's another franchise that comes available, the franchisor often will approach somebody who, you know, is kind of like staffing up or building them up. They'll then approach them and say, hey, like, you're in our good books, or you've done a good job, or whatever, this one's come available. So once you're in, sometimes it's easier to grow or to get more. It obviously depends on the particular type of franchise as well.
Question for you. So, I guess just growing the business. So a franchisor, let's say, decides that they wanted to open up another location nearby. So I would assume that they would ask the franchisee if it's possible, first right of refusal?
It depends. If you're the franchisor, you would never give away a right of first refusal. Like, there would just be no motivation to do that. If you're the franchisee, you could ask for that, but it would depend on your leverage to be able to get that. But the real reason, like, if you had a map, let's say, right, you had a city. This is our city, and you're gonna have a franchise, you know, here, 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 whatever. Then if you looked at sort of let's say you had like a 2-kilometer radius, and you put the radius around here, the new franchises maybe could go here as long as the radius didn't overlap with any of these things. Like, there's not a lot of places left if they're honoring the obligation for the non-compete.
Yeah.
So they usually have those set before they start looking for franchisees. They usually say, here's our city, and we know we're gonna have 17 franchises, and that's it. So they don't often open up new ones because they would get themselves cross-threaded with the obligations they have.
Okay, what happens if the red expanded?
If the red expands, then yeah, like, so let's say the city grows,
Yeah.
right? So the city grows, and now this line doesn't exist. Bad artwork. Then the closest place, like, they would have to, you know, the closest place still, it has to grow quite a bit before they can have a new one, right? In order for the radius not to overlap. And then what they would do is probably make that available. They wouldn't have an obligation to go back to any of these people.
But, okay, but they would ask them if they're in good standing or if they would want another location?
Probably not.
No.
I mean, they might,
Yeah.
they might, but they wouldn't have an obligation to do that,
Okay.
generally.
Yeah.
I mean, so let's say one person, I don't know, like, owned 4 of them, then maybe they'd say, hey, if we open up a 5th one here, we'll do that. I had a franchise, a guy, they were in Calgary, and doesn't matter. They contemplated, at the time that my guy got in, the franchisor was contemplating opening up a new one if the population went above a certain amount. And then because they didn't have sort of geographical restrictions, they had these, anyways, it was measured differently. And they had said to my guy initially, hey, when you buy your franchise location, or when you acquire your franchise location, are you interested in another one? He said, well, I don't think so, because he wanted to grow, like he wanted one in Calgary and one in Edmonton, like he wasn't interested in another one. He didn't want to compete with himself in Calgary. So he said, I don't think so, but go ahead and ask me the question at the relevant time. If that happens, go ahead and ask me the question. And they did. He said, I'm definitely not interested, but I'm willing to sell mine. So if you find a new guy who wants to open in that location and he wants 2 locations, let me know. And they were like, that's the dumbest thing we've ever heard of. Why would we tell you that? And so nothing ever came of that. So they're not super motivated to offer that. There's no downside if you're the franchisee. There's no downside ever in having a right of first refusal, but the franchisor is not likely to want to just offer that up, because it restricts them, right? It imposes a whole process on them. They have to give notice. You have to let them have a certain amount of time to decide. You probably have to talk about, building plans, or are you buying, are you leasing, can you get the financing? And the franchisor, if they've decided that they want to move quickly. They don't want to be tied up for 30, 60, 90, 6 months, whatever, number of days, to have somebody be like, man, I'm not interested. So it would be rare for the franchisor to want to do that. If you're buying up like 3 or 4 or whatever, you might get that, but it would be a negotiation. Okay, so why consider a franchise? So from the franchisor's perspective, if you have a successful business that you think can be replicated and can be sustained, so that location over there can operate just as well without me at the table as that location over there, then yeah, you've got a model that probably is a good candidate for franchising, and it's a good way to grow the business. You've done it once, you've got this cookie cutter, and you can just sort of start executing on putting more cookies in the mix. And if you've got the equipment suppliers, food suppliers, if it's a food location, if you've got those relationships, it's a win-win for everybody, because of course a food supplier, they can take food to 2 locations versus 1. So it's easy to replicate those things. It's a no-brainer for them. But you've got to really be sure, if you want to, as a franchisor, if you want to be able to replicate your business, you've got to be really certain that it stands alone and that it can execute just as well in that location as it does in this location. If you're not sure about that, or there's something special about this one location, it's not a great sort of bet in order to franchise it. But if it works, it's a very easy way. It's a very tried and true method to be able to replicate the model in other locations. From the franchisee's perspective, if you're going to spend money investing in a business, better have someone teach you how to do that than you have to sort of stumble and figure it all out on your own. You've got people, you've got resources, you've got other franchisees you can speak to, you've got the franchisor who gives you that operating manual, who gives you the recipe for how to do it, who introduces you to the suppliers. So it can be a pretty seemingly low risk way to sort of get into a new business that maybe you're not familiar with from the get-go. So I just want to talk, and the reason why I'm going to talk about this, it's not because I'm a lawyer and like to talk about legislation, but this will become clear. So in Canada, the franchise laws are governed provincially. So the Franchise Act in Alberta is completely different from the Franchise Act in Manitoba, completely different from in PEI, and so it's not harmonious, it's not the same. And so if you are the and then of course as you move to other countries, like the US has 52 different ways of putting out franchise legislation by state. As you move to other countries, they also sort of divide it up regionally like that. So if you are a franchisor, you have to comply with the legislation in the place where you're going to open your franchise location. So if you are a US-based business and you want to have a franchise location in Alberta, you have to comply with the Alberta Franchise Act. If you then want to open one in BC, doesn't matter if you've complied with the Alberta legislation, you then have to comply with the BC one. So from the franchisor's perspective, it can be very onerous and very expensive, because you almost certainly have to get legal counsel in all of those different places to make sure that you're complying. The disclosure and the compliance rules and obligations can be vastly different in different places. So you've got to be committed, you've got to be prepared to invest in the regulatory regime And the franchise legislation, and we'll come to this here right away, the franchise legislation is very, very, very onerous. In fact, it's probably the most onerous legislation that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. It's considered consumer protection legislation. So if I'm a little franchisee and I've got my $1 million and I'm gonna go to the bank and I'm gonna borrow $1 million so that I can go and buy into a McDonald's franchise, the government doesn't want me to be stupid, they can't believe that, but they don't want me to waste my $1 million and make a bad business investment because I don't have all the information that I properly should have in order to make the educated decision that this franchise is a good idea or that it's a terrible idea or whatever. So because it's consumer protection legislation, and we'll come to this in a second, there's this really rare remedy that doesn't come up in law very often called a right of rescission. And every franchise agreement that's signed in this province has a 48-hour kind of cooling off period. So I can sign up all my franchise documents, I can sign up all my personal guarantees, everything is good to go, and then I can be like, oh, 48 hours later, I'm not cool with this, and I want out, and nobody can do anything about it. So, and then, if I'm tricked, or I'm misled, so you're given all this information about the franchise, and you're told, yeah, it has profit, you just follow the recipe, and you'll get guaranteed profit of $2 million, and that turns out not to be true if I've truly followed the recipe, I can say, I'm out. I want to be put back in the position I was in before I got into this franchise. So if I had to buy a building, if I had to buy a bunch of equipment, if I had to take out a bank loan and I'm paying interest on that, you, the franchisor, pay me a whole crap load of money and put me back in the position I was in before I got into your terrible business idea. So the disclosure obligation is enormously onerous, and the consequence of that, if you haven't disclosed it, can be devastating for a franchisor. So the franchisors need to be very careful and very sophisticated and very diligent about what they are disclosing, because people can get out of it so easily. And we've acted for lots of people who've gotten out and the bar's really low. Yeah, he lied to me, he told me that I was getting $1 million, so I got 900,000, I want out, and they get out. So it can be really dangerous if you're the franchisor. The franchisees can abuse that, so obviously it's not like the bar's not too low, but you need to be aware of that. So in the Franchises Act in Alberta says that, I think it's a week, maybe 5 days before you sign a franchise agreement, you as a franchisee must be provided with a full, complete, and material disclosure document, it's called. And the disclosure document, and I'll show you here in a second, it has 21 categories of information that you have to have full and complete disclosure about. And you have to have that disclosure document for about a week before you sign your franchise agreement. And then if you're still prepared to move forward, then you can go ahead and sign your franchise agreement. If you then are lied to or you're misled or whatever, you can still get out of it. But you must have your disclosure document before you sign the franchise agreement. And if somebody tried to say, here's your disclosure document, please sign here, you can still get out of it after the fact. So people take the franchise bundle of documents very seriously, because it's pretty rare. There's not many contracts in law that allow you kind of to get a jail-free card, but franchises are one of them, and it's premised in the theory that the Franchise Act is consumer protection legislation. So if you think about in the franchise regulation, or regulations to the Franchise Act, it tells you that these are all of the elements, and I've got 2 slides about this. There's 21 categories of information that you have to disclose, and the level of disclosure is very, very high, and it constantly changes, right? So if you have to disclose all of the bankruptcies. So if you had 700 McDonald's franchises and franchisee number 432 went bankrupt, that has to be disclosed in there. It has to say he started a business on this day, he lasted for 4 years, and he went bankrupt on this day. And then if you have now 800 franchises, that constantly has to be updated, right? As new information becomes available, and as you get more franchises, that the obligation to disclose gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So if I bought a McDonald's franchise last year, the disclosure document that I got and you bought one today would be different, because a year's worth of information has happened. You have to, so the next one maybe, financial statements, so it's kind of shows up in a couple places. Financing, initial investment required. You have to be very, very detailed in what is required, in what is required to start up the franchise, in what is required to keep the franchise going. You have to provide the financial statements. Obviously, every year that goes by, those financial statements change. So if anybody's thinking of starting a franchise business and they're given a franchise disclosure document, in a month's time or 2 months' time, that information's changed, your franchise disclosure document is outdated. So you have to be constantly vigilant and constantly updating that. This is what's required. So if anybody has sued you, you had some dispute with any of your little franchisees, you've got to disclose all of the details about that. If you've ever had any administrative proceedings, like, you know, the health inspectors came over and they found mice in your building because you didn't have proper, I don't know, like ways to stop the mice from coming in or whatever it is, you have to disclose all of that. And if you don't, if they closed a franchise, you have to disclose what the working capital requirements are. And if you don't have adequate disclosure in these items, then there's a potential right to rescind the contract, which again is pretty rare.
Sorry, quick question. Is there a certain time frame that you should be looking for? And I understand the lawyer would be looking for this. Is it based on a yearly basis, every 6 months?
Yeah, your franchise disclosure document, I think, has to be current within 30 days.
30 days.
So
Oh, okay.
maybe 60 days, but it's pretty recent.
Okay.
So, and that's why it's always changing. So these are the 21 categories in Alberta. In Ontario, they're similar, but they're not the same 21 categories. Like probably the information you get there the same way, but the way that the Franchise Act in Ontario is set up, the categories are slightly different. So again, from the franchisor's perspective, it's really onerous because you can't just take the same franchise disclosure document. You know, in Canada, you're gonna have 10 different ones or 12 different ones. And then when you go to the US, you know, you have to express things in US dollars or, you know, so you can't just sort of replicate that. So it's a big operation to be the franchisor. Oh, and then this last one, you have to disclose if anybody has ever rescinded a contract. So if any franchisee has ever said, hey, this is a terrible idea and you lied to me, you gotta disclose that in your franchise document. Even if it wasn't really successful, if 10 people have tried, you have to disclose all of that. If anybody's ever sued you, if you've ever been personally bankrupt, all of that comes out in the wash. So it's very onerous from the franchisor's perspective. From the franchisee's perspective, the idea is it's meant to give you all the information you need in order to be successful at running your business. So what is the effect if you don't provide the disclosure? We've talked about this. If the disclosure document is not provided, or if there are material errors or lapses in the document, as the franchisee, you can be put back in the position you were in before you went down the little rabbit hole of getting a franchise. So if that cost you $5 million, then if you're successful, the franchisor is gonna have to give you that $5 million back, and they're gonna have this location where there isn't a franchise, and they're gonna have this, you know, bad rap on their franchise disclosure document about how things went badly. So everybody is motivated to make it work, but don't take on the obligation of a franchisor lightly. Like, make sure you really understand what you're getting yourself into, because it can be, you know, the franchisor can be liable, and you have that very uncommon remedy of being able to rescind the franchise, which is pretty rare at law. So if you are considering purchasing a franchise, do your homework. You should have all the information you need in that very extensive franchise disclosure document. But you still need to think, like lots of people think, well, I need $1 million because that's what it says from a working capital perspective I need. That's fine, but some of these things that we've talked about, like the particularities around making sure that you also comply with the Alberta building codes or you get the city permits, none of that would be reflected in the kind of the recipe because those things vary by jurisdiction. So in addition to the franchise fees and the ongoing royalties that you'll pay on a monthly basis to the franchisor for the privilege of using their, you know, their trademarks and their logos and their brand and their relationship with their suppliers and their software and all of that, you're going to have some additional costs related to compliance at a local level. You're going to have your employees to hire. Minimum wage can be different in the various locations. Sometimes you can't get workers just at minimum wage. So all of those considerations that you would have in running a business of any sort, regardless of whether it's a franchise business, come into play in addition to the obligations that you have in your franchise model. And so you really need to understand what those are by your sort of particular type of industry or business, and make sure that you can cover those costs, that you understand what those are, that you've got the banking resources, whatever you need. Often franchises require that you sign a personal guarantee. So if you set up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Alberta Ltd to run the McDonald's on the corner, and your franchise agreement is going to be with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Alberta Ltd, they're also probably almost certainly going to require that you sign a personal guarantee. You then have your personal assets exposed and on the line. If things go badly, they could sue you and collect, take your house, take your car, those kinds of things. So you really need to understand what the ask is, what the requirement is, and so it's one thing for them to disclose a lot, but they're going to ask a lot of you as well, to make sure that you're fully committed to the success of the business. So if you're if you're thinking about setting up a franchise business, you want to make sure you have enough history. So if you're the second company to ever franchise this, there's not going to be a lot, even though you have to have this disclosure document. If there's only one other franchise, the track record is not very long. So you just need to make the decision, understand whether you have enough history for the disclosure to be meaningful, that it's relevant for your particular location. In Canada or in Alberta, probably the statistics or the information for the Alberta based franchise locations is more meaningful than the one in Sydney, Australia, or in the UK. So you want to make sure that you're sort of comparing apples to apples as much as possible when you're doing your homework. You want to consider sort of that picture that I drew you, the geographical separation, the non-compete territories, making sure that there's enough population that will be served by your location, that for it to be meaningful, for it to be profitable. So you have to have done your own investigation, your own homework, and made the business, the business decision that this makes sense. And then, from a working cap requirement, in addition to whatever the working cap is that they require, you've got to factor in your own employees, your own specifics around minimum wage, and all of those things that are particular to the location. I think the rest of those are pretty straightforward. So people often, they're like, well, that sounds like a pretty terrible idea. Like, franchising isn't as sexy as we thought that it was going to be. Especially if you have the business idea and you're the one who's trying to replicate and grow your business that way. So common alternatives is just licensing. So getting out of the obligation to have the franchise disclosure document. You can license your business, you can license your trademark, you can license a process, you can license a piece of equipment. So depending on what your business is and what you're trying to do, there are lots of ways to sort of avoid the traps of a franchise and still get the growth, which is usually what people are looking for from a franchise perspective. So franchising, you can just open up another location, see if this works maybe in 2 locations before you start franchising it, get a little bit more history, a little bit more data, so that your disclosure document's a bit more meaningful. Distribution agreements can be another thing, so another consideration. So if you have a product or you have a service and you're providing that service or selling that product in Alberta, and you want to take that to Ontario, you might find a partner out there and say, well, you have the rights to license this or to sell it or to provide the service in Ontario. I'll do it in Alberta, you do it in Ontario. So you can appoint people, by geographical location to sort of replicate what you're doing without going down the full, franchise. I don't have the operating manual, I don't have all of those trappings with it. So these are some pretty common alternatives to franchising if you think that the obligations of being a franchisor are onerous, which they are. So just in terms of a summary, if you're considering being the franchisor, know what you're getting yourself into. You need to be very prepared for the legal rigmarole associated with complying in each different jurisdiction that you're going to, making sure that your franchise disclosure document is current, making sure that it's updated every time somebody sues you, make sure that your working capital targets are reflected in the proper currency, that they reflect, the difference between the sales tax that exists maybe in BC that doesn't exist in Alberta. Like, it's got to be very, very customized. So if you're considering being a franchisor, you've got to be very diligent and very committed to that ongoing regular reporting requirement. for any new person who wants to come on side, or wants to consider being a franchisee and making sure that you're just being very, very onerous, or very diligent about the owner's obligations. You also, if you're considering being the franchisor, need to have a process to be able to screen people. So how do you, when you have these 10 people who have decided that they want to submit an application, what's the criteria for how you're going to decide one versus the other? And the costs of rescission are really high. The cost of lawsuits are really high. So you need to have the financial wherewithal to be able to stand that. If you're considering acquiring a franchise or buying a franchise, no, you have to know that despite all of the comprehensive disclosure that's provided to you, there are no guarantees. The market could crash. People might not, they might not like your particular franchise. You might not have the market that you think you do. So you need to know that there is no guarantee. And you need, therefore, to have satisfied yourself that this makes sense financially, that this makes sense from a business perspective, that you've got some way to protect your personal assets, that you don't have too much exposure or more exposure than you're willing to take on. You need to decide whether you're doing that alone, whether you're doing that with a business partner, what your contributions are. So all the same considerations you would have starting any business are the same from a franchise perspective, with the additional cost requirement, because a franchisor will require you to pay royalties to the franchisor, usually on a monthly, sometimes a quarterly basis, depending on the franchise. So in addition to whatever your employee costs are, whatever your lease costs are, whatever that is, you also have to make sure that you're profitable enough to be able to send that royalty amount back to the franchisor. So, end of the day, cost-benefit analysis to determine whether it's worth it on both sides, right? If you're the franchisor or the franchisee, and know what your alternatives are, know what other ways you might be able to accomplish the same thing. That's all I got.
Are the royalty amounts specific to the market as well, or are they generally standard?
They're generally standard. So like McDonald's will have a royalty amount, Tim Hortons will have a royalty amount. They might change, change it by, like if you're a kiosk in a food court versus your standalone location, but they won't generally differ much. They might be like Alberta-wide, US, or Canada-wide, US-wide, but they won't generally differ by like 109th Street in Jasper versus.
Yeah. You mentioned the minimum wage, so that question comes to mind.
You typically would have a percentage?
It can be. It can be a percentage. Sometimes there's two funds. So sometimes people will say, or the franchisor will say, you need to pay me 1% based on all your sales, like based on your revenues or whatever. Sometimes it's based on profit, which gets scarier. But that can also work towards you. That it could work for you if you're in a minimum wage in an elevated minimum wage, because then your profit is less. But profit is always good, so you don't want to decrease that. They also will sometimes say you have to pay us like 2% or 5% on a quarterly basis for an advertising revenue, because like if you're McDonald's and you have billboards or you have TV ads, you will have to contribute to that. It won't be optional. So, and that could be measured slightly differently. That might be not necessarily on profit, it might be on revenue. So they'll set it out, they'll be very clear about what it is. So you'll have some initial upfront cost, and then you'll have some ongoing quarterly, monthly, whatever it is, royalty amount. Sometimes it's it's like a percentage of profit. Sometimes it's all profit above a certain amount. So they can gouge you in various different ways.
And then do they have like a setup fee?
Yeah.
Initial setup
Oh, yeah.
fee,
And usually like $100,000 application fee. So yeah, they'll get you every which way.
Any other questions?
Is there like agreement term between a franchisor and
Yeah,
franchisee?
Yeah, it also depends on the franchise. I would say 10 years is maybe probably the most common thing that I see. And then minimum. Like they won't commit if you don't want to. If their term is 10 years and you said, oh, I only want 8, they won't consider you. So but they'll often then have renewal terms. So they might say, it's 10 years with 2 5-year renewal rights. You have to be in good standing, meaning your royalties have been paid. You have to be in good standing for them to consider extending it. And then there'll be a whole bunch of termination provisions. So if you haven't paid royalties, if you're difficult, if you wear a blue shirt on Tuesdays, like all kinds of reasons why they could consider terminating.
And then are there points where like the franchisee could, keep
Almost certainly not. I think I've seen that once, and that was because the franchisor was going under. The franchisor was getting out of business, and they didn't care at that point. But it's pretty rare.
Because I saw at one time, the name changed because they went into the States. And so they have different names in the States than in Canada.
Yeah.
And so after like a 10-year, 15-year term, they could either decide to change the name or to that sort of
To the new name, yeah.
or they would branch off.
Right. So I mean, there can be some variations in that, but it's not
Usually doesn't.
not typical. Yeah.
How does it affect the franchisee if the franchisor decides to open and operate their own location near them, say?
So the franchise agreement will say, you know, like kind of the picture that I drew, that there can't be a franchise within a certain radius. So the franchisor couldn't do that. If you had a franchise agreement for your location, and I was a franchisor, I could not set up a location that violated that radius. So that theoretically couldn't happen. It would be, but let's say it was outside of that radius, it would be no different than a franchisor letting you be the next franchisee. So whether the franchisor set it up, typically the franchisor doesn't do that. That's a bit of a different one. That's kind of like the Starbucks model, which is more of a corporate owned and affiliate run model. So they get around all the franchise requirements by not franchising. And then they have, you know, headquarters or the corporate store own locations, and then they can really do whatever they want because they don't have a contract with you that says that they won't. So if it's a true franchise, they shouldn't be able to get too close to you based on whatever's setting in the franchise agreement.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming today, but thank you most. Is there another question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so Starbucks is more of a licensing enterprise than,
Yeah, it's not a franchise. They don't have any franchise locations. They call it corporate. They have some stores that are corporate owned, and then they have some stores that I think they call like partners. So like, I think it's Safeway that has some Starbucks or Sobeys or whatever it is. So Safeway in that example would be like a corporate partner, and they might have a deal where they could have, I don't know, 250. They could open a Starbucks in 250 of the 500 Safeway stores across the country, and they can pick the ones based on, you know, whatever they want. So they would then just have a deal. They would have some kind of a right to use the cups or like the logo and to set up the signage and all of that stuff, but they don't franchise. There's like CrossFit gyms are not franchises either. They call them affiliate models, so they call them like fancy things to avoid them being called franchises. Which is pretty cool.
Thank you so much for coming here today.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks very much. That's great. And that's my contact information. Yeah, I've got cards if anybody wants a card. I think I have cards. I have cards.
Yeah, and if you could just fill out the happy face thing, stick it face down on the desk on your way out, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, for sure. For sure. That was great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming. And I did think you sent cards. That's perfect. Oh, yeah, I think you told me that. Yeah, I do.